On a bitter winter morning in February 1992, in the small manufacturing town of Sheboygan, Wisconsin, a young woman named Christine Weber left her apartment to pick up groceries from the Piggly Wiggly on North 8th Street. She was 23 years old, a dental assistant at Dr. Hammond's practice downtown, known for her bright smile and her habit of wearing mismatched socks on purpose to make the children in the waiting room laugh. She told her roommate she would be back within an hour. The drive was short, barely 3 miles. The store wasn't crowded on Tuesday mornings. She carried $20 in her purse and a shopping list written on the back of a dental supply invoice. Christine Weber never came home. Her car was found 2 days later in the parking lot of a shuttered paper mill 15 miles away. Keys still in the ignition. Driver's seat pushed back farther than Christine's 5'3" frame would require, and a single drop of blood on the steering wheel that didn't match her type. For 33 years, her disappearance remained an unsolved mystery, a cold case that haunted a community and destroyed a family. Then, in the autumn of 2025, a phone call from a woman who could barely speak through her tears would crack the case wide open and lead investigators to arrest someone who had been hiding in plain sight all along. The question that would shake Sheboygan to its core was not who took Christine Weber, but how someone everyone trusted could carry such a secret for more than 3 decades. Clear's throat. What really happened on that February morning, and why did it take so long for the truth to surface? Sheboygan sits on the western shore of Lake Michigan, a working-class city of roughly 50,000 people where the wind off the water cuts through your coat in winter, and the smell of bratwurst drifts from backyard grills in summer. In 1992, it was a place where people still left their doors unlocked, where high school football games drew crowds of thousands, and where the closing of the local tannery had left an economic wound that hadn't quite healed. The downtown stretched along 8th Street with its brick storefronts and family-owned businesses, the kind of Main Street America that was already beginning to fade even then. Christine Weber had grown up just outside the city limits, in the township of Sheboygan Falls, the youngest of 3 daughters born to Richard and Susan Weber. Her father worked the line at Kohler Company, the plumbing fixtures manufacturer that had employed generations of Sheboygan families. Her mother taught 3rd grade at Horace Mann Elementary. Christine had graduated from North High School in 1986, where she played clarinet in the marching band and volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday. Those who knew her said she had a gift for putting people at ease, that she could talk to anyone about anything, that she collected ceramic frogs and listened to Whitney Houston on repeat, and sent birthday cards to people she barely knew just to make them feel remembered. She had moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Superior Avenue in the fall of 1991, sharing the space with her friend Rachel Nordstrom, who worked at the public library. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a converted house, with creaking floorboards and radiators that clanked at night. Rachel would later remember that Christine had been in good spirits that winter, excited about a possible promotion at the dental office, planning a trip to Door County in the spring. On the morning of February 11th, a Tuesday, the temperature hovered around 18 degrees. Fresh snow from the previous night covered the cars parked along the street. Rachel was still asleep when Christine left around 9:30, whispering a quick goodbye and closing the door softly behind her. Christine wore her winter coat, the navy blue one with the fake fur collar, and her favorite red scarf. She carried her brown leather purse, the one with the broken zipper that she kept meaning to fix. The shopping list was brief: milk, bread, eggs, orange juice, ground beef, and a box of spaghetti. Ordinary items for an ordinary morning. The route from the apartment to the Piggly Wiggly was straightforward. Down Superior to 8th Street, then north for about 2 miles, past the shuttered factories and the VFW hall and the elementary school. The roads had been plowed but were still slick in places. Christine drove a 1987 Honda Accord, silver with a dent in the rear bumper from a minor fender bender the previous summer. She had told Rachel she would be back by 11, in time to watch The Price is Right while they ate lunch. At 10:15 that morning, a clerk at the Piggly Wiggly named Donald Kepler would later tell police he saw a young woman matching Christine's description standing in the cereal aisle, but he couldn't be certain it was her. No one else remembered seeing her. No receipt was ever found bearing her name. The security cameras, old and poorly maintained, had malfunctioned that week and recorded nothing but static. When Rachel woke at 11:30 and found Christine still gone, she felt the first flutter of concern but pushed it away. Maybe Christine had run into a friend. Maybe she had stopped somewhere else. By 1 o'clock, Rachel called the dental office. Dr. Hammond's receptionist said Christine had the day off and wasn't expected until Wednesday. At 2 o'clock, Rachel called Christine's parents. Susan Weber's voice tightened immediately. She said Christine always called if she was going to be late, always. Richard Weber drove to the apartment within 20 minutes. Together, he and Rachel began making phone calls. The hospital, the police, friends from high school, no one had seen her. No one had heard from her. At 4:30 that afternoon, Richard Weber walked into the Sheboygan Police Department and filed a missing persons report. The officer who took the report, a sergeant named Thomas Brandt, noted that Christine had been gone for only 7 hours. He suggested she might have left town voluntarily, might have needed some space, might show up by evening with a reasonable explanation. Richard Weber looked at the sergeant and said quietly, "You don't know my daughter." Clear's throat, something in his voice made Brandt pick up the phone and call the watch commander. By nightfall on February 11th, police had begun a preliminary search. Officers drove the route between the apartment and the grocery store, looking for signs of an accident, a car in a ditch, anything that might explain the absence. They found nothing. The Piggly Wiggly manager confirmed that no one matching Christine's description had used a credit card or check at the store that day, though cash purchases left no record. Wednesday morning brought a wider search. Volunteers from the community gathered at the National Guard Armory on Pennsylvania Avenue. The Weber family stood before the crowd, holding a framed photograph of Christine, her smile bright and untroubled. Susan Weber could barely speak. Richard Weber thanked everyone for coming and asked them to focus on areas near water, near wooded lots, anywhere a car might have gone off the road unnoticed. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees. The snow continued to fall in light, persistent flurries. Search teams fanned out across the county, walking through parks and industrial areas, checking abandoned buildings and vacant lots. The local television stations ran stories that evening. Christine's face appeared on screens across northeastern Wisconsin. The tip line rang constantly, but nothing led anywhere. A woman thought she saw Christine at a gas station in Manitowoc. Someone else reported a silver Honda at a rest stop near Green Bay. Every lead dissolved into nothing. On Thursday, February 13th, 2 days after Christine disappeared, a county sheriff's deputy named Martin Kowalski was driving past the old Riverside paper mill on County Road Y, about 15 miles west of Sheboygan. The mill had closed in 1989, its buildings left to decay, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds pushing through the asphalt. Kowalski noticed a silver car parked near the far end of the lot, partially obscured by a snowdrift. He pulled in to investigate. The car was a Honda Accord. The license plate matched the registration for Christine Marie Weber. The deputy's hands were shaking as he called it in. Within an hour, the parking lot was flooded with law enforcement. Crime scene technicians photographed the vehicle from every angle before anyone touched it. The car was unlocked. The keys dangled from the ignition. The driver's seat had been pushed all the way back. The backrest reclined slightly. Christine, at 5'3", would have needed the seat much farther forward to reach the pedals comfortably. Inside the vehicle, investigators found Christine's purse on the passenger seat, her wallet still containing $20 and her driver's license. They found the shopping list. They found a cassette tape in the stereo, Whitney Houston's "I'm Your Baby Tonight," stopped mid-song. They found her winter gloves on the dashboard. What they did not find was Christine, or any clear sign of what had happened to her. The blood on the steering wheel was small, just a single drop, but it was enough to test. The results came back within a week. Type AB negative, rare enough that only 1% of the population carries it. Christine Weber had type O positive. The blood belonged to someone else. Investigators processed the car for fingerprints and found dozens, too many to separate and identify with any certainty given the technology available in 1992. They searched the area around the paper mill on foot and with search dogs. The dogs picked up no scent trail. The ground was frozen solid, covered in snow. If Christine had been there, if she had walked away from the car or been carried, the evidence had been erased by winter. Detectives began constructing a timeline. Christine left her apartment around 9:30. The Piggly Wiggly clerk thought he might have seen her at 10:15, but couldn't swear to it. Her car was found at the paper mill 15 miles away. If she had driven straight there from the apartment, the trip would have taken perhaps 20 minutes. That left a window of time, from 9:30 Tuesday morning until sometime late Tuesday or early Wednesday, when the car could have been abandoned in that lot. The mill was isolated, surrounded by empty fields and thin strips of forest. The nearest house was more than a mile away. No one reported seeing the car arrive. No one reported hearing anything unusual. Investigators began interviewing everyone who knew Christine. Her roommate Rachel, her coworkers at the dental office, her family, her friends from high school. They spoke with ex-boyfriends and casual acquaintances. They asked about conflicts, about anyone who might have wished her harm, about strange phone calls or unwanted attention. The picture that emerged was of a young woman universally liked, without enemies, without secrets that anyone knew of. Dr. Hammond, her employer, said Christine was reliable and kind, never late, never distracted. The hygienist said she brought homemade cookies to the office every Friday. Her high school friend said she had been dating someone briefly the previous fall, a man named David Rehnquist who worked in insurance, but they had parted amicably and he had since moved to Milwaukee. Police tracked down Rehnquist and confirmed his whereabouts on February 11th. He had been in a meeting with clients all morning, witnessed by 4 people. He seemed genuinely devastated by the news and offered to help in any way he could. Deputies whispered quietly among themselves about the details that didn't fit, the pushback seat, the missing woman, the blood that wasn't hers. Some thought it indicated an abduction, that someone taller had driven the car to the mill and left it there. Others wondered if Christine had been meeting someone, if she had gotten into the car voluntarily with a person she trusted. But why? And where had she gone from there? The investigation expanded. Police checked hospitals across the state for unidentified patients. They reviewed reports of traffic accidents and Jane Does. They contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring states. Christine Weber seemed to have vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Her photograph remained on the evening news. Her parents appeared at press conferences, begging for information, for her safe return, for anything. Susan Weber aged a decade in a matter of weeks, her face drawn and pale, her voice barely a whisper. Richard Weber stopped sleeping, spent his nights driving the back roads, searching, always searching. By March, the active investigation began to slow. Detectives had pursued every lead, interviewed hundreds of people, searched thousands of acres. They had nothing. The case was not officially closed, but the daily urgency faded. The television stations moved on to other stories. The volunteers who had walked the fields and forests returned to their normal lives. The Weber family was left with silence and unanswered questions. Rachel Nordstrom moved out of the apartment on Superior Avenue that spring, unable to bear the emptiness, the waiting for a door to open that would never open again. Christine's room remained untouched for months, her ceramic frogs lined up on the shelf, her clarinet case leaning in the corner, her mismatched socks still in the drawer. Clear's throat. For those who have ever waited for someone who will never come home, who have felt the peculiar agony of not knowing, the Weber family's pain was an open wound that would not heal. The years passed slowly. 1992 became 1993, then 1994. The Christine Weber missing persons case became one folder among many in the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Department, reviewed occasionally when a new detective took interest or when a tip came in, but never solved. The Weber family tried to move forward, though moving forward felt like betrayal. Richard Weber retired early from Kohler Company, his focus destroyed, his spirit broken. Susan Weber left her teaching position after suffering a breakdown in her classroom one afternoon, when a student asked her what had happened to the girl in the photograph she kept on her desk. Christine's two older sisters, Jennifer and Amy, struggled in their own ways. Jennifer, the eldest, became obsessed with true crime stories, reading everything she could find about missing persons cases, searching for patterns, for answers that might explain what had happened to her baby sister. Amy withdrew, moving to Minnesota, distancing herself from the pain that saturated every corner of Sheboygan. In 1997, 5 years after the disappearance, a detective named Sarah Holbrook reopened the case file as part of a cold case review initiative. She read through all the reports, all the witness statements, all the dead ends. She drove out to the old paper mill, now even more decrepit, its windows shattered, its roof caving in. She stood in the parking lot where Christine's car had been found and tried to imagine what had happened. Holbrook interviewed some of the original witnesses again, hoping that time might have loosened memories or consciences. She found nothing new. The case went back into the file cabinet. In 2003, advances in DNA technology prompted another review. The blood sample from the steering wheel was retested with more sophisticated methods, but without a suspect to compare it against, the results meant nothing. The DNA profile was entered into databases. No matches were found. Christine Weber remained missing. Her case remained cold. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the creeping suspicion that the person beside you might be harboring something dark, the years that followed held a different kind of tension. In the spring of 1995, 3 years after Christine disappeared, a woman named Margaret Hausman walked into the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Department and asked to speak with someone about the Weber case. Margaret was 41 years old, a bank teller at First National, a woman known for her precision and her silence. She told the deputy at the front desk that she had information, but she needed to speak privately. The deputy led her to an interview room and called for Detective Brandt, who had taken a continuing interest in the case despite its official dormancy. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady but quiet. She said she had known Christine Weber, not well, but well enough to recognize her from the photographs that still appeared occasionally in the newspaper, whenever the anniversary of her disappearance came around. She said she had noticed something in 1992, something that had bothered her at the time but that she had dismissed as coincidence. Now, 3 years later, the coincidence had grown too large to ignore. On the morning of February 11, 1992, Margaret had been driving to work early, around 9:45, taking Route Y past the old paper mill because it was faster than the highway. She had seen a silver car, a Honda she thought, parked in the mill lot. That detail alone was unremarkable. What stayed with her was the second vehicle, A dark blue pickup truck parked beside it and two figures standing between the cars, talking. She couldn't see faces from the road. She didn't stop. But one of the figures had been wearing a red scarf, bright against the gray morning. Margaret had read that Christine Weber had been wearing a red scarf the day she disappeared. Detective Brandt leaned forward. "Why didn't you come forward in 1992?" he asked. Margaret looked at her hands. "I thought I might be wrong," she said. "I thought maybe it wasn't the same car, the same person. And then when the car was found there 2 days later, I convinced myself I had the day wrong, that I must have seen it on Thursday after she was already missing, not on Tuesday. But I've been thinking about it for 3 years, and I know I saw what I saw on Tuesday morning. I remember because I was listening to the radio and they were talking about the primary elections coming up. That was only on Tuesday. By Thursday, the news was all about the missing girl." Brandt asked about the pickup truck. Margaret said it was dark blue, possibly a Chevrolet older model with some rust around the wheel wells. She hadn't seen the license plate. She couldn't describe the second person in detail, only that they were taller than the figure in the red scarf, and they had been standing close together, not in a way that suggested conflict, but in a way that suggested conversation, perhaps familiarity. The information was entered into the case file. Investigators attempted to track down dark blue pickup trucks registered in Sheboygan County in 1992. There were hundreds. Without more specific information, the lead went nowhere. Margaret Hausman's testimony was noted and filed, but it planted a seed of possibility. Christine had driven to the paper mill or been driven there, and she had met someone with a blue truck, someone she talked to without apparent fear, someone who might have been the last person to see her before she vanished. The question became, who did Christine Weber know who drove a blue pickup truck, and why would she meet them at an abandoned mill on a Tuesday morning when she was supposed to be buying groceries? In 1998, Richard Weber's health began to fail. He had developed heart problems, exacerbated by years of stress and sleeplessness. He died in January 1999, 7 years after his daughter disappeared, never knowing what had happened to her. Susan Weber, already fragile, retreated further into herself. She moved into a smaller house in Sheboygan Falls, surrounded by boxes of Christine's belongings that she could neither display nor discard. Jennifer and Amy returned for their father's funeral and were struck by how thoroughly grief had dismantled their mother. She spoke to Christine as if she were still alive, setting a place for her at dinner, buying birthday presents that piled up unopened in the spare bedroom. The family, already fractured, splintered further. Jennifer stayed in Wisconsin, visiting her mother weekly, holding on to the hope that someday they would have answers. Amy kept her distance, unable to bear the weight of the unresolved. The community of Sheboygan, too, had moved on in the way communities do when time passes and tragedies fade from the front page. The paper mill was eventually demolished in 2004. The lot was paved over and turned into a small industrial park. The place where Christine's car had been found ceased to exist in any physical sense, though it remained vivid in the minds of those who remembered. Occasionally, a local newspaper would run a retrospective piece on the anniversary of her disappearance. Occasionally, someone would call the tip line with a new theory or a vague recollection. But the case had grown cold not just in official terms, but in the public consciousness. Christine Weber became a name on a list, a photograph in a file, a story that older residents told to newcomers when explaining why they still locked their doors at night. Then, in September 2025, 33 years after Christine Weber drove away from her apartment and never returned, the phone rang at the Sheboygan County Sheriff's Department. The woman on the line could barely speak through her tears. Her name was Emily Novick. She was 38 years old, and she said she needed to tell someone what her father had done. Clear's throat, the detective who answered the call. A young investigator named Lucas Dern, who had been assigned to the cold case unit only 6 months earlier, listened as Emily Novick's voice cracked and steadied and cracked again. She said she had been thinking about this for years, decades even, but had been too afraid to come forward. She said her father's name was Thomas Novick. She said he had driven a dark blue Chevrolet pickup truck in the early 1990s. And she said that, when she was 5 years old, in February 1992, her father had come home one morning with blood on his hands and a look in his eyes that she had never forgotten. Detective Dern asked Emily to come to the station. She arrived 2 hours later, accompanied by her husband, her hands shaking, her face pale. In the interview room, she told a story that had haunted her entire life. Thomas Novick had been 34 years old in 1992, a construction worker who took odd jobs around Sheboygan County. He had been married to Emily's mother, Patricia, but the marriage was troubled, marked by arguments and long silences. Emily remembered her father as unpredictable, sometimes kind and playful, other times angry and withdrawn. On the morning of February 11, 1992, Emily had been home sick from kindergarten. Her mother was at work, cleaning houses in a wealthy neighborhood on the north side of town. Thomas had told Patricia he was going to a job site, but Emily remembered him leaving around 9 o'clock and returning before noon, much earlier than expected. She remembered him coming into the house through the back door, not the front. She remembered him going straight to the bathroom. She remembered seeing his hands when he emerged, still wet from washing, and the faint pink color of the water that circled the drain. Emily said she had asked her father if he was hurt. He had looked at her for a long moment, then told her he had cut himself on a piece of metal at the job site, that it was nothing, that she should go back to watching television. But there was no bandage on his hands. There was no visible wound. And later that evening, Emily had noticed that the blue pickup truck, usually parked in the driveway, had been moved to the back of their property, half hidden behind the garage. The next day, when news of the missing dental assistant spread through town, Emily's mother had mentioned it at dinner. Patricia Novick said how terrible it was, how the poor girl's family must be going through hell. Thomas Novick had said nothing. He had stared at his plate and eaten in silence. Emily, 5 years old and scared by something she couldn't articulate, had watched her father's face and felt a coldness settle in her chest. In the weeks and months that followed, Emily noticed changes. Her father became more withdrawn, more irritable. He snapped at her for small things. He stopped playing with her the way he used to. The blue truck disappeared one day, sold, her mother said, to a man from out of state. A different vehicle appeared in its place, a red sedan. Emily's parents argued more frequently, their voices low and tense behind closed doors. In 1996, when Emily was 9, her parents separated. Patricia took Emily and moved to Milwaukee, and Thomas stayed in Sheboygan, alone in the house that had never felt warm. Emily saw her father sporadically after that, awkward visits that felt like obligations. He died in 2019 of liver failure, his body wrecked by years of drinking, his secrets, if he had any, buried with him. Or so Emily had thought. What changed, she told Detective Dern, was finding a box in her mother's attic earlier that month. Patricia Novick had passed away in July 2025, and Emily had been sorting through her belongings. In a cardboard box marked Tom's Things, Emily found old photographs, tax documents, and a small spiral notebook. The notebook contained her father's handwriting, erratic and cramped, dates and locations and fragments of sentences that made no sense until Emily read one entry from late February 1992. It read, "Can't stop thinking about the mill, the red scarf in the water, should have driven farther, should have made sure." Emily had stared at those words for hours before she understood what they meant, before she allowed herself to understand what they meant. Her father had been involved in Christine Weber's disappearance. The red scarf, The mill, the blood on his hands, the truck sold and replaced, it all connected. Detective Dern took the notebook into evidence. He contacted the prosecutor's office and the original investigators still alive and available. The notebook was analyzed by forensic handwriting experts who confirmed it belonged to Thomas Novick. The entry about the mill was dated February 27, 1992, 16 days after Christine disappeared. Dern reopened the case file and read through Margaret Hossman's 1995 statement about the blue pickup truck at the mill on the morning of February 11th. He tracked down Margaret, now 70, and showed her a photograph of Thomas Novick from 1992. She said the quality of the photo made it hard to be certain, but the build was right, the height was right. It could have been him. Investigators pulled records of Thomas Novick's employment in 1992. He had worked for a small contracting company that had since gone out of business, but tax records showed sporadic income and no verifiable job on the morning of February 11th. The DNA sample from the steering wheel was compared against a sample obtained from Thomas Novick's autopsy records, preserved by the medical examiner as a matter of routine. The results came back in October 2025. The blood on Christine Weber's steering wheel was a match to Thomas Novick, type AB negative, rare and unmistakable. The prosecutor, a determined woman named Catherine Voss, reviewed the evidence and determined there was enough to pursue charges, even though the primary suspect was deceased, but someone else was still alive. In early November 2025, investigators discovered that Thomas Novick had not been working alone. Phone records from 1992, painstakingly reconstructed from archived data, showed multiple calls between Thomas Novick and a man named Gerald Kepler, the younger brother of Donald Kepler, the grocery clerk who claimed to have seen Christine at the Piggly Wiggly. Gerald Kepler was 62 years old in 2025, living in a small ranch house on the outskirts of Sheboygan, retired from a career in trucking. On November 18, 2025, Detective Dern and 3 other officers arrived at Gerald Kepler's home with a warrant. Kepler answered the door in his bathrobe, his face unshaven, his eyes widening when he saw the badges. He was read his rights and arrested on suspicion of involvement in the 1992 disappearance and suspected death of Christine Marie Weber. The arrest shocked the community, not because anyone remembered Gerald Kepler as particularly notable, but because 33 years had passed and the case had been all but forgotten by everyone except the Weber family. Kepler was taken into custody and interviewed for 6 hours. At first, he denied everything, claimed he barely knew Thomas Novick, said the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But when confronted with the phone records, with the notebook entry, with the DNA evidence, his story began to crumble. He admitted finally that Thomas Novick had called him on the morning of February 11, 1992, and asked for help. Novick said there had been an accident, that he needed someone to drive a car, that it was urgent. Kepler said he had owed Novick money from a poker game and felt obligated to help. He said he met Novick at the paper mill around 10:30 that morning. He said he saw Christine Weber's body in the bed of Novick's truck, wrapped in a tarp. He said Novick told him she had been hitchhiking, that Novick had picked her up, that they had argued, and that things had gotten out of hand. Kepler said he didn't ask questions. He said he followed Novick in Christine's car to a remote area near the Kettle Moraine State Forest, about 30 miles west of the mill. He said they buried her there, in a shallow grave beneath a stand of pine trees, and then drove back separately. Kepler said Novick had threatened him, told him that if he ever spoke about what happened, Novick would make sure Kepler went down with him. Kepler said he had lived with the secret for 33 years, terrified and trapped by his own complicity. Investigators, led by Detective Dern, organized a search of the area Kepler described. On November 22, 2025, in a wooded section of the Kettle Moraine, cadaver dogs alerted near a cluster of old-growth pines. Forensic teams began excavating carefully, sifting through layers of soil and decayed leaves. On November 24, they found human remains. The skeleton was incomplete, scattered by animals and time, but enough remained for identification. Dental records confirmed that the remains belonged to Christine Marie Weber. She had been 23 years old when she died. She had been in the ground for 33 years. The autopsy revealed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, consistent with a violent assault. The medical examiner could not determine the exact cause of death with certainty, but the evidence suggested she had been struck multiple times and had likely died quickly. The news of Christine's discovery spread rapidly through Sheboygan. The local television stations ran special reports. The newspaper published a front-page story with Christine's high school photograph beside an image of the forest where she was found. The Weber family, what remained of it, was notified before the information went public. Jennifer Weber, now 57 years old, spoke to reporters outside her home. She said she felt relief mixed with unbearable sorrow, grateful to finally know the truth but devastated by the confirmation of what she had feared all along. She said her mother, Susan, was in a nursing home now, her mind diminished by dementia, and would likely never fully understand that her youngest daughter had been found. Jennifer said she wished her father had lived to see this day, to know that Christine had not simply vanished, that there was an answer, however painful. She said the family would lay Christine to rest properly now, beside her father, in the cemetery at Sheboygan Falls. Gerald Kepler was charged with being an accessory after the fact to first-degree intentional homicide, obstruction of justice, and concealing a corpse. His trial began in March 2026. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curiosity seekers, and older residents who remembered the case from 1992. Kepler's defense attorney argued that his client had been coerced, that Thomas Novick had been the aggressor, that Kepler had been young and frightened and made a terrible mistake. The prosecution, led by Catherine Voss, argued that Kepler had made a choice, that he had actively participated in covering up a brutal crime, and that his silence for 33 years had denied the Weber family closure and justice. Emily Novick testified, her voice shaking, describing the morning her father came home with blood on his hands, the notebook entry, the years of suspicion and fear. Margaret Hossman, now 71, testified about seeing the blue truck and the red scarf. Forensic experts testified about the DNA match and the remains found in the forest. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On March 30, 2026, they returned a verdict, guilty on all counts. Gerald Kepler was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He was led away in handcuffs, an old man who would likely die behind bars, paying for a crime committed decades earlier when he might have spoken up and chose silence instead. The Weber family attended the sentencing. Jennifer sat in the front row, holding a photograph of Christine, the same photograph that had appeared on missing persons posters in 1992. When the judge asked if she wished to make a statement, Jennifer stood. Her voice was steady. She said that her sister had been kind and gentle and had deserved a life full of joy and love and ordinary moments. She said that Christine had been stolen from them, not just by the violence that ended her life, but by the years of not knowing, the years of hope and dread and searching. She said that while the verdict could not bring Christine back, it meant that someone had been held accountable, that the truth had finally been told, and that Christine's name would no longer be a question mark but a person, remembered and mourned. The case of Christine Weber, missing since 1992 and found in 2025, became a reminder of how long secrets can be buried and how deeply they can wound. It revealed the ways in which violence ripples outward, destroying not just the immediate victim but families, communities, and the fabric of trust that holds people together. It showed that justice, however delayed, still matters, and that the truth, however painful, is better than the agony of uncertainty. Christine was laid to rest in May 2026 in a small private ceremony attended by her surviving family and a few close friends who had never forgotten her. The grave marker bore her name, her dates, and a single line: "Gone but never forgotten, now at peace." For those who have ever wondered if cold cases matter, if the pursuit of justice decades later serves any real purpose, the answer lies in the faces of the people left behind. Jennifer Weber said in an interview after the trial that she could finally sleep at night, that the nightmares had stopped, that knowing what happened to her sister had lifted a weight she had carried for more than half her life. She said it didn't erase the pain, but it transformed it from a raw, open wound into a scar, still tender but no longer bleeding. She said her sister's story mattered, that every missing person's story matters, and that giving up on the truth is a betrayal of the people we have lost. The town of Sheboygan, too, found a kind of closure. The case that had haunted the community for 3 decades was finally resolved. The fear that had lingered, the sense that something terrible had happened and no one knew why, was replaced by knowledge. It was grim knowledge, but knowledge nonetheless. And in that knowledge, there was the possibility of moving forward without the shadow of the unknown. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.